I think that there is a real concern about Africa becoming a kind of Wild West for AI disinformation and for cybercrime more broadly. In Africa, we looked specifically at AI disinformation, particularly at times of elections, and we saw a number of deepfakes that were used in elections in Nigeria and also in South Africa. South Africa, the most recent election in 2024 in May. We saw the use of deepfakes for endorsing particular candidates. So in the South African case, there was a deepfake of Donald Trump allegedly supporting the leader of the MK party, that's the former President Jacob Zuma, a new entrant to the political landscape in South Africa. The party was only created 6 months before the election. And that was used to basically give the impression that this particular party was getting the support of who's now the President of the United States. We also saw the use of AI deepfakes for narrative support, to be able to support a particular narrative. Again, in the South African context, narratives tapped into deep-seated fears about racial divisions in South Africa. So we saw deepfakes, for example, that were suggesting that one particular party, AfroForum, was rounding up black voters and arresting them for walking around after dark. And we also saw the use of AI deepfakes for satire. We've got a long history of satire in many African countries, particularly in countries like South Africa and in Kenya. And we've seen it being used in times of national crisis. In 2022, for example, there was a video that surfaced from Burkina Faso, and it looked like a political campaigning video in support of the leaders of a coup who took power in September 2022. Problem was, the people in this political campaign video weren't actually real human beings, they were avatars. And they were avatars created by a company called Synthesia. And the narrative was that the Burkina Faso government was getting the support internationally, and that was the message that was coming through in this campaign video. It was very difficult to trace who the originators was, but it went viral. What we did was to classify the actors and to rather look at the individuals, but look at the groups that they represent. We obviously have political actors who are a mixture of people who are ideologically driven digital specialists, or they're paid for influencers. These are people who we call them influence for hire merchants, and we're seeing a very active marketplace for paid for influence across Africa, who are paid to amplify certain narratives. Sometimes they'll receive packages of material, pre-packaged video content that they'll be paid to amplify, and they can make many thousands of US dollars from doing that. We're also seeing criminal actors using AI disinformation for the purposes of deceiving people for fraudulent enterprises. And that's everything from also using identity theft, so using avatars to pretend to be a well-known television personality, for example, to endorse a particular fraudulent scam. We've seen that happen in South Africa. We've also seen the use of AI disinformation by some terrorist actors to a limited extent across Africa. And we looked at the South African example, again, the recent elections there. We didn't see as much AI-driven content as we imagined. And we think that's partly because in South Africa, and if we're looking for nation state and we're looking for Russia-driven content, there isn't necessarily a need to use AI, expensive AI, to be able to shape a narrative. What we would like to be able to do in future is look at the impact and spillover effect from social media into mainstream media, because many particular community-based media organizations are hungry for content, and it's very easy to look at a story that's online that may not have been verified and to be able to use that as content. And by doing that, you're amplifying it at scale. I think the other thing that we've seen, which has been interesting, is the use of AI in places such as Rwanda to be able to flood out dissent. What I mean by that is there's been some studies that have shown that the government of Paul Kagame in Rwanda has used techniques to be able to flush out any dissenting voices simply by being able to game the algorithm in such a way that pro-Kagame content gets privileged over every other content. And by doing that, what it means is readers, when they go onto their feed, will generally see more favourable content supporting the leadership of Rwanda rather than some of the dissenting voices. So it's another way of trying to control the narrative. I think what we are seeing governments do is using something called the liar's dividend to be able to dismiss material as being fake, even though it may well be real and verifiable fact. Because we've got now this kind of polluted information environment, it's very, very easy for it to be used opportunistically. Race in particular is an issue that we see elevated, particularly in South Africa. But we're also seeing certain divisions over neo-colonialism. So the neo-colonial narrative is being used, especially by Russian disinformation practitioners, to be able to build a kind of sympathy between what is experienced in many African countries and what is seen as a geopolitical hot potato. And so we do see, for example, Russian disinformation practitioners tap into that concern, that neo-colonial narrative, and use it for their own end, particularly in terms of trying to push a particular narrative with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. Areas of similarity, we are seeing moral high ground and religion also being used. We didn't look specifically at Uganda, but we know that, for example, LGBTQI issues are being used and weaponized to associate particular projects. And we know that one of the tactics of Russian disinformation practitioners is to stand in opposition to that by elevating the role, for example, of the Russian Orthodox Church in countries like Uganda. We haven't seen a lot of deepfakes, but we have seen, I've talked about the deepfake use of candidate endorsement during elections. I think we are way behind in terms of even thinking about regulation in the same way that we've seen in Europe. And I think one of the biggest problems is access to data so that researchers can understand the scope of the problem and then come up with solutions to deal with it in the same way that we've seen in Europe. There is a hunger to be able to create a level playing field between Europe and Africa, such that the big tech companies allow researchers the same access to data, if they're Africa-based researchers, as their counterparts in Europe. But I think the short-term solution has to be digital literacy and trying to build resilience within mainstream media. What that means is creating programs that educate consumers of social media news and social media content more broadly about the fact that they actually could inadvertently be being useful idiots. But also journalists trying to go back to journalism schools and inculcate in the journalist profession what they're there for. And then more broadly is public information campaigning. Again, I think it's got to be quite targeted. I think it probably needs to be targeted in the first instance at communicators or people in government, civil servants, so they also understand the nature of the threat.